Right, so I'm Jeremy Mitchell. I'm the current chair of the Edward Thomas Fellowship and the trustee of Petersfield Museum and keeper of the Edward Thomas Study Centre, which is the most favourite job of all. But as such, I'm ideally placed to be a co-organiser and host of this festival with my colleagues Ryan Watts, who's with us tonight, and Lauren Wayland from the museum. We're also grateful to players of the National Lottery whose support has been instrumental in bringing this festival to you. I'm thrilled to be welcoming back our friends from the Robert Frost Society for another fascinating evening of discussion and poetry. As you'll hear, Edward Thomas and Robert Frost's friendship developed on the tracks and roadways they walked together through the English countryside, which has given us the theme of roads and pathways for this year's festival. Members of the panel include Edna Longley, Robert Hass, Virginia Smith and Donald Sheehy from the Robert Frost Society, Cuthbertson, Ralph Pite, Gregory Dowling, and Tom Durham, with Gordon Clapp joining us via pre-recorded readings as he's heavily involved in a large-scale production in the US, so cannot be with us in person this evening. The evening will include poetry readings of both men's work and is being enjoyed from the unique setting of our Victorian courtroom lecture theatre, as well as from the comfort of many homes throughout the world, as we live stream the event via Zoom. And the talk is being recorded and will be available in due course for a short period once the festival has finished. And without further ado, you don't want to hear from me anymore, so I'll hand you over to Guy, who is going to start the evening off for us.
Hello, I hope everybody can hear me. It's a very wet day in Petersfield here, but I hope it's a lot drier wherever you are. I've been asked to start by reading out a section from the dedication that Thomas wrote to his book, The Igneold Way, and also with a little extract by Thomas's friend Harry Hooton talking about walking with Edward Thomas. So what Harry Hooton said of Thomas was what we will begin with. He said that the nearby Pilgrim's Way in Kent was a favourite resort, and it was here that we took the first of a long series of walks together, sometimes for long days, at others for 2 or 3 days at a time. As we started, so for many years, our ritual was unvaried. Neither intruded on the privacy of the other, neither was so silly as to point out the endless beauties of the country. We just walked in healing silence, Edwy now and then pausing to make some notes in a pocketbook. The open air was his joy and his workshop. And then Edward Thomas dedicated his book, The Igneold Way, which came out in 1913, to that friend, Harry Hooton. And I'm now going to read out a section from that dedication. It is right that I should remember you upon a walk, for I have walked more miles with you than with anyone else except myself. While I walked, you very often danced on the roads of Kent, Sussex, Surrey, and Hampshire. This evening, when I went out on the Sarn Helen, everybody was in chapel, I think, unless it was the Lord, for he also seemed to be walking in the cool. I was very much alone and glad to be. You were a ghost, and not a man of 14 stone.
Sorry.
You okay, John?
Yes.
And I thought that perhaps after all that shadowy salute would be fittest. But I have put my pen to paper. I have set out, and I will come to an end. For, as I said, I am a writing animal. In the days of those old walks, I could have written a dedication in Norfolk jacket style, all about the open road and the search for something over the hills and far away. I should have reminded you at some length how Borrow stayed at this inn, and that the Dollo Coffey is the house where he could have lived with satisfaction if backed by a couple of thousands a year. Today I know there is nothing beyond the farthest of far ridges except a signpost to unknown places. The end is in the means, in the sight of that beautiful long straight line of the downs in which a curve is latent, in the houses we shall never enter, with their dark secret windows and quiet hearth smoke, or their ruins friendly only to elders and nettles? In the people passing, whom we shall never know, though we may love them. Today I know that I walk because it is necessary to do so, in order both to live and to make a living. Once those walks might have made a book. Now they make a smile or a sigh, and I am glad they are in ghostland and not fettered in useless print. This book for you was to have been a country book, but I see that it has turned out to be another of those books, made out of books founded on other books. Being but half mine, it can only be half yours, and I owe you an apology as well as a dedication. It is, however, in some ways a fitting book for me to write, for it is about a road which begins many miles before I could come on its traces and ends miles beyond where I had to stop. I could find no excuse for supposing it to go to Wales and following it there into the Cedric Valley, along the Towie to Carmarthen and so to St. David's, which is now as holy as Rome, though once only a third as holy. Apparently, no special medieval use revived it throughout its course, or gave it a new entity like that of the Pilgrim's Way from Winchester to Canterbury, that you and I walked on many a time. By the Cock at Detling, the Black Horse at Thurnham, the King's Head, once I believe the Pilgrim's Rest, at Hollingbourne, above Harrietsham, past Theodora Villas, above Laneham and Robert Philpott's Woodman's Arms, and so on to Eastwell. Always among beech and yew and Canterbury bells, and always over the silver of white bean leaves. I could not find a beginning or an end of the Icknield Way. It is thus a symbol of mortal things, with their beginnings and ends always in immortal darkness. I wish the book had a little more of the mystery of the road about it. You at least will make allowances and additions, and God send me above many other readers like you. As this is the bottom of the sheet, and ale is better than ink, though it is no substitute, I label this dedication and wish you with me inside Dole Coffee Arms at Plumpset in Carmarthenshire.
The path. Running along the bank, a parapet that saves from the precipitous wood below the level road. There is a path. It serves children for looking down the long, smooth steep between the legs of beech and yew to where a fallen tree checks the sight, while men and women content themselves with the road and what they see over the bank and what the children tell. The path, winding like silver, trickles on, bordered and even invaded by thinnest moss that tries to cover roots and crumbling chalk with gold, olive and emerald, but in vain. The children wear it. They have flattened the bank on top and silvered it between the moss with the current of their feet, year after year. But the road is houseless, leads not to school. To see a child is rare there, and the eye has but the wood, has but the road, the wood that overhangs and underyawns it, and the path that looks as if it led on to some legendary or fancied place where men have wished to go and stay. Till suddenly it ends where the wood ends.
Somebody's reading from Frost.
The road not taken. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps a better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by. And that has made all the difference.
The sun used to shine while we two walked slowly together, paused and started again, and sometimes mused, sometimes talked, as either pleased, and cheerfully parted each night. We never disagreed which gate to rest on. The to-be and the late past we gave small heed. We turned from men or poetry to rumours of the war remote, only till both stood disinclined for aught but the yellow flavourous coat of an apple wasps had undermined, or a century of dark betonies, the stateliest of small flowers on earth at the forest verge, or crocuses, pale purple as if they had their birth in sunless Hades views. The war came back to mind with the moonrise, which soldiers in the east afar beheld then. Nevertheless, our eyes could as well imagine the Crusades or Caesar's battles. Everything through faintness, like those rumours fades, like the brook's water glittering under the moonlight, like those walks now, like us two that took them, and the fallen apples, all the talks and silences, like memories sand, when the tide covers it late or soon, and other men through other flowers in those fields under the same moon go talking and have easy hours.
Iris by night. One misty evening, one another's guide, we two were groping down on Malvern side the last wet fields and dripping hedges home. There came a moment of confusing lights, such as according to belief in Rome were seen of old at Memphis on the heights, before the fragments of a former sun could concentrate anew and rise as one. Light was a paste of pigment in our eyes. And then there was a moon, and then a scene so watery as to seem submarine, in which we two stood saturated, drowned. The clover-mingled rowan on the ground had taken all the water it could as dew, and still the air was saturated too, its airy pressure turned to water weight. Then a small rainbow, like a trellis gate, a very small moon-made prismatic bow, stood closely over us through which to go. And then we were vouchsafed the miracle that never yet to other two befell, and I alone of us have lived to tell. A wonder, bow and rainbow as it bent, instead of moving with us as we went, to keep the pots of gold from being found, it lifted from its dewy pediment its two mote-swimming, many-coloured ends, and gathered them together in a ring. And we stood in it softly circled round, from all division time or foe can bring, in a relation of elected friends.
Man and dog. 'Twill take some getting. Sir, I think 'twill so. The old man stared up at the mistletoe that hung too high in the poplar's crest for plunder of any climber, though not for kissing under. Then he went on against the north-east wind, straight but lame, leaning on a staff new-skinned, carrying a brolly, flag basket and old coat, towards Alton, 10 miles off. And he had not done less from Chilgrove, where he pulled up dogs. 'Twere best, if he'd had a money box, to have waited there, till the sheep cleared a field for what a half-week's flint picking. His mind was running on the work he'd done since he left Christchurch in the New Forest one spring in the 70s, navvying on dock and line from Southampton to Newcastle upon Tyne. In 74, a year of soldiering with the Berkshires, hoeing and harvesting in half the shires where corn and couch will grow. His sons, 3 sons, were fighting, but the hoe and reap hook were what he liked, or anything to do with trees. He fell once from a poplar tall as these, the flying man, they called him in hospital. If I flew now to another world, I'd fall, he laughed, and whistled to the small brown bitch with spots of blue that hunted in the ditch. Her foxy Welsh grandfather must have paired beneath him. He kept sheep in Wales and scared strangers, I will warrant, with his pearl eye, of shrinking off as he was shy, then following close in silence for what? No rabbit, never fear, she ever got, yet always hunts. Today she nearly had one. She would and she wouldn't, just like that, the bad one. She's not much use, still she's company, though I'm not. She goes everywhere with me. So Alton, I must reach tonight somehow. I'll get no shakedown with that bedfellow from farmers. Many a man sleeps worse tonight than I shall. In the trenches. Yes, that's right. But they'll be out of that, I hope they be this weather, marching after the enemy. So I hope. Good luck. There I nodded. Good night. You keep straight on. Stiffly he plodded, and at his heels the crisp leaves scurried past, and the leaf-coloured robin watched. They passed. The robin till next day, the man for good, together in the twilight of the wood.
The Gum Gatherer. There overtook me and drew me in to his downhill early morning stride, and set me 5 miles on my road, better than if he had had me ride. A man with a swinging bag for a load, and half the bag wound round his hand. We talked like barking above the din of water we walked along beside. And for my telling him where I'd been and where I lived in mountain land, to be coming home the way I was, he told me a little about himself. Higher up in the pass, where the grist of the new beginning brooks, his blocks split off the mountain mass. And hopeless grist enough it looks, ever to grind to soil for grass. The way it is will do for moss. There he had built his stolen shack. It had to be a stolen shack, because of the fears of fire and loss that trouble the sleep of lumberfolk. Visions of half the world burned black, and the sun shrunken yellow in smoke. We know who, when they come to town, bring berries under the wagon seat, or a basket of eggs between their feet. What this man brought in a cotton sack was gum, the gum of the mountain spruce. He showed me lumps of the scented stuff, like uncut jewels, dull and rough. It comes to market golden brown, but turns to pink between the teeth. I told him, this is a pleasant life, to set your breast to the bark of trees that all your days are dim beneath, and reaching up with a little knife to loose the resin and take it down and bring it to market when you please.
That's the end of the readings, I think. They were beautiful, moving as always. And so I think, Edna or Robert, are you ready to lead off with discussions?
Well, obviously, walking and the paths that Thomas and Robert Frost walked as elected friends, as Frost said, were absolutely crucial to their bonding. in that August of 1914. And, you know, they represent a kind of long tradition of poets who have walked together, probably most famously Wordsworth and Coleridge. Both of them were famous walkers. Both of them were inclined to travel into the woods or the paths of their countrysides, their respective countrysides, for a variety of reasons. And we'll talk about some of those reasons. And I think that their love of the flora and fauna of their respective countrysides is one of the things that grew them or bonded them together. Each of them recognizes in the other a kindred spirit almost immediately, the compulsions to go out and walk into the countryside or the woods all of the time, the necessity and the obligation of returning back to home and domestic life or to the city were prominent in their walks as well. So always the sense of going out and coming back, I think, was a pretty standard feature. You know, in many ways, they represent the kind of pastoral ideal that we see in both English and American pastoral poetry. That middle ground between wilderness and civilization was that area they liked to traverse best. And I think they moved easily and beautifully between those two poles, always with the idea that home would draw them back at some point, and with the idea that the woods and the countryside would draw them out again. So it's always this going forth and coming back, this going forth and coming back, and both of them recognizing in the other that this was an absolutely compelling and necessary part of their lives.
Yeah, it's extraordinary how many, virtually all of Thomas's poems involve or mention a road, a lane, a path, a way, and how often too the speaker is walking or implicitly on a walk, observing, discovering, and Thomas's in Thomas's prose books, in what he called particularly his country books, there are so many, again, roads, paths, and so much walking already before the poems. The Icknield Way, we've obviously heard from, but in the South Country too, there's a great celebration of paths and roads. And I think already too, the idea in Thomas's country books, as in at the beginning of the Icknield Way, that the road is, the path is also symbolic, it's metaphysical. That idea is in his prose as in his poems. And I think that Thomas was perhaps more of a walker and also a professional walker than Frost, because he did undertake those walks, as with the Icknield Way, in order to make his books, to construct his books, and as a lot of you may know, Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, was actually initially conceived, at any rate, as an imitation of Thomas, based on going for those walks with Thomas, because he was amused by Thomas's habit of regretting that they hadn't taken maybe a different path, a better way. So I think that's a very extraordinary fact, that in some way Frost wrote Edward Thomas's first poem, because The Road Not Taken was written before Thomas began to write poetry, and that he, in a sense, anticipated the symbolism of so many of Thomas's poems. And the path is an early poem, as is the signpost, And these are poems which seem to take off from or respond to The Road Not Taken.
Speaking of poems written about Thomas by Frost, want to linger just for a moment on Iris by Night and notice how extraordinary it is in Frost's career. It's a poem that achieves a certain kind of transcendence, a sort of spiritual elevation in a way that very few of the poems do. Frost resisted what might have been seen as a kind of easy romanticizing. Such moments had to be earned. And whether that moment occurred or not, in Frost's imagination, it forms a kind of seal on their friendship that elevates it out of the realm of the physical, the actual, into a kind of transcendent union. It's a gorgeous love poem.
Yeah.
And one wonders, one can't help but wonder whether the poem would have been written if Thomas had survived. It almost required that Thomas be freed, in a sense, from actuality in order to be idealized in such a way. It is among Frost's poems a truly extraordinary moment. And I just wanted to call attention to that.
Very good.
Edna, would you see Iris by Night as a companion to The Sun Used to Shine?
Yes, absolutely. In both of them, there's the phrase "we too." Both of them are about we too, and it's interesting that Donald used the called Iris by Night a love poem. I think they are twin love poems. However, you want to construe that love, obviously deep friendship and a friendship in poetry. That there is a religious quality, religious language in Iris by Night, a miracle, elected friends, and that I think maybe does suggest that the religion of art or the religion of poetry, as well as an extraordinary communion between the two friends in the poem, and the walk in Iris by Night and the walks in The Sun Used to Shine. They have that sort of almost pilgrimage quality. I know that the Thomas's books, the Icknield Way and A Literary Pilgrim in England, are being grouped together as pilgrimages in the Oxford edition. But it's almost in both The Sun Used to Shine and Iris by Night. The two poets are on some extraordinary spiritual journey together, and The Sun Used to Shine, of course, where the walking and talking are absolutely intertwined and are also the basis for the rhythms of the poem itself, and that's where Frost and Thomas are obviously very close and have exactly the same ideas about the relationships between speech and poetry, and so all their poetic affinity is enacted in rather different ways in both these walking poems.
Can I just come in on Iris by Night again? I think it's interesting that one of the interesting aspects of the miracle is the way he turns the rainbow into a circle. The rainbow is, if you like, the symbol of everything that is evanescent, unattainable. And now it becomes a circle, which is like an image of permanence, holding the two men together. I wonder whether this was deliberate. At the very end, he says, it's two mote swimming many-coloured ends. That many-coloured reminds me of another famous use of many-coloured by Frost in Birches, where he says as that he describes the birches as they turn many-coloured as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. And that image was famously taken up by Richard Wilbur to say that what Frost was doing in Birches was, if you like, taking Shelley's dome of many-colored glass from Adonais and sort of bringing it down to earth. You know, Shelley's poem is all about transcendence, getting beyond the earth, and Frost's poem is Earth's the right place for love in Birches. And it seems to me that in Iris by Night, he's going the other way. This is his sort of homage to this is a very Shelleyan poem, I would say. And I think it's I think it's interesting that this is perhaps I would say it's possibly his most Shelleyan poem. And I don't know whether was deliberate or not, but that's the way it comes across to me.
And also in its own right, an elegy, so that the borrowing is doubly appropriate.
Yeah. Because he says we too, but he says I alone of us have lived to tell. So he's a witness.
Well, I'd like to add something, follow up on Edna's observation about the kind of the religious feeling to this poem, with a specific reference to the rowan tree, which here in the US we might call the mountain ash, but the rowans was associated with the Druids. And the Druids would actually conjure spirits by burning rowan wood. And so this is, I think, a reference I'm sure Frost was probably aware of. And something else remarkable about this event, this is one thing I can't get over, is it was so amazing. I mean, Thomas himself actually wrote about it in November of 1914, just a prose piece in The Nation. And so we can actually pretty much pin the date. And this is from John Evangeline Walsh's book, to August 24th. So we know the date. So as magical as this may seem, and perhaps not right to try to pin it down, and as I am prone to like make it seem factual, I think it was. He talks about a waxing crescent, and the astronomical records show that it was a waxing crescent that night. Or he talks about a golden crescent is what Thomas describes it as. But I think both men never forgot, and in fact, immediately understood the significance of it.
Isn't there another religious connection with Iris by Night, in that some people say it's been influenced by Piers Plowman, or at least it's aware of that concept in Piers Plowman of seeing a miracle on a Malvern hillside, which is where they are as well. And Frost, I think, talked about it as Piers Plowman country, I think, when he was in Durham.
Another thing that strikes me about Iris by Night and Thomas's poems is that one thing that strikes me, being an American and having traveled to Great Britain and Scotland, is one of the things that immediately strikes you is that as an American, you recognize that you're traveling to a land with a far more ancient history, where you see the ruins of Roman roads, you see Stonehenge, for example, you see Pict ruins and so forth. And there are references in both poems where, Thomas mentions Caesar and the Crusades, and Frost mentions Memphis, for example. And it's almost as if they're both kind of positioning themselves in a much longer historical lineage as the inheritors of the kinds of bonds that other human beings must have developed as they were traveling to various parts of the world. And I find that fascinating. I can imagine Thomas being a wonderful guide, taking Frost around the countryside and showing him some of these ancient places that simply aren't available in the United States, except for when, maybe you go to Mesa Verde, for example, and see some Native American hieroglyphs and so forth. But that sense of a kind of long-standing historical permanence strikes me about both of these poems.
Tom, as a reader of them, do you have any thoughts?
Well, the thing that struck me from that discussion there is that the change from the Icknield Way prose with its topographical pedestrian details of just going on a walk and observing everything in a sort of very, very deliberate way. And suddenly, in more and more of the poems that I'm looking at and being asked to do, they seem to be the haloed round business of this capsules of eternity, whether it's the path is going to legendary places, a sort of Arthurian quest is going on with the silver path, which only the children really seem to appreciate. And then it suddenly stops at the end of everything stops, whether it's old man or all sorts of things. These moments of capsules of eternity I've come up with is just quite extraordinary. And I did ask somebody at one stage, did Vivekananda, when he did he affect England as much as he did with America and Emerson? This sort of strange state which is beyond the temporal, where you enter a sort of strange charged atmosphere. And more of the poems seem to have these sort of very isolated, haloed moments. And one, yes, the Ash Grove poem, where there's an ash grove which is actually circled by a wall, and he walks through the ash grove, and time stops because he sort of says it's only 100 yards long or something, but he was in a very strange state.
The Ash Grove Light Path is a poem in which there's, to go to what Bob was saying, there's a lot of history. You know, when you're reading the path, it seems that it's simply close observation of a path, but in fact the history of the path, the wearing of it, which actually is a connection with the road not taken, and at the same time, as you've just been saying, it brings in the possibility of some more transcendental experience, maybe a poem, maybe it's poetry at the end of the path, and then it just stops. So there's all kinds of layers and ambiguities. And the syntax, once again, is very much part of the path, kind of winding and going in unexpected directions, and that's how we read it. And Thomas is always leading us along paths and taking us in unexpected directions, and indeed Frost precisely does that too.
There's also the lane. I've just spoken the lane for a church, so I'm Michaelmas moment. And that's very extraordinary because there it's autumn and September and everything, but it's one of those days when it's as warm as summer, it's as quiet as winter, and it's as beautiful as spring. And they're all together and the birds are trying to sing because it's so nice. And then, like the path, it ends, as soon as the lane ends for a mile, stops, and everything is the same. He says, time was not the same. And then, oh, everything is the same again. So we sort of come from the poetic realm back to the quotidian realm. I'm getting
to my mind, they're reading Thomas's prose and then turning to the poems. We're almost talking about two different ways of walking. Icknield Way is a kind of professional walker. He's walking for a purpose and with a purpose, and as he gathers that purpose, it includes history and close observation and just endless naming of places. If you're an American reading the book and you're not familiar with the particular vicinity, it becomes a kind of catalog of place after place after place after place. But it's almost as though Thomas learned, or he had inherent in what he was doing, a different kind of walking, and that is the purposeless walking that Frost is always engaged in. Frost very rarely goes out on a walk to get from one place to another, or to learn the path. His one determined effort to walk as Thomas walked failed when his shoes went bad on him and he couldn't complete the long trail hike and had to take a train from one part to another and was always very embarrassed by it. But there seem to be two different ways of walking that correspond to two different ways of thinking. And recent research I've been doing, once we decided to do this program, I've been doing a lot of research into walking and creativity. And there's some very interesting research going on at Stanford University about just how deeply linked creativity is to walking. There are different theories proposed that it engages both hemispheres of the mind simultaneously, that it allows for both deliberative and associative thinking. But it's almost as though Thomas became an amateur walker with Frost, and it's out of the amateur walker's experience that the poetry seems to come. I realize that's an oversimplification, but it seems to me as you move from the prose to the poems, it's a different kind of observation, and it's a refusal to think purposefully that opens up the possibilities for thinking creatively.
Yeah, I completely agree, Donald, about that in relation to Edna and the poems. I mean, I think one kind of counter that would be that Thomas is walking in for the heart of England and South Country is more rambling and purposeless. He's notorious for saying, "Oh, I don't know where I'm going to go. I'll just walk a bit and then I'll turn left every bit and eventually I'll come back home." So there is a kind of similarity actually between some of Thomas's habits of walking and Frost's sense that it should be purposeless, as well as there being in Thomas particularly with Edna and Pursuit of Spring, a sense of I've got an end goal, I've got a route to follow, or I've got a target, I've got a pilgrimage to get to. I think the Literary Pilgrim book is quite also interesting because it doesn't have the same, as it were, linear trajectory as Pursuit of Spring, but that's a more miscellaneous book, and the various writers that are kind of described in that pilgrimage each have their own territory. And one of the things which has been really striking as we've all been talking about Iris by Night is that sense of the circle being enclosed by the rainbow. And it reminded me of some of the comments that Thomas makes in 14 and 15 about nationalism and the sense that a nation is built up not out of uniformity, but out of overlapping individualities, that everybody has their own little territory, but it relates to and overlaps with other people. So we're all within our own circle, but each of our circles overlaps and extend. The other thing which has really struck me as people have been talking is about deep time and history. And one of the interesting things about the Malverns is that southern end of the Malverns where they're walking, so the Ledbury end, the major sort of summit of that is what's sometimes called Herefordshire Beacon, but also known as British Camp. And it's an Iron Age fort, and it's a Neolithic centre that, and they would have known how deeply historical this landscape was, as well as having, as guys pointed out, those connections with Piers Plowman. It's a very, very deeply historicised landscape in which they're walking and finding traces of Memphis, just as they're finding traces of the Iron Age.
Which, when we get to Directive in Frost, you see him trying to manufacture that sense of history, to try and lay the poem into an ancient landscape. But in order to do so, he can't take it for granted. He has to almost create it as a background.
We've been talking about poems in which Frost and Thomas, we two walk together. I really would like to know from the Frost end what you make of the two poems in which the poets walk with other people, with more local people. Certainly Man and Dog is another walk that's very laden with history. The itinerant labourer whom the Thomas speaker meets is coming from a past, and his work navvying on dock and line and work on farms and so on, and walking into a very uncertain future, which involves the war in which his sons are fighting. And I just wonder, do you see that the difference that Bob has alluded to between American landscape and English or landscape in these islands, with reference to the difference between the gum gatherer and man and dog, maybe rather arbitrary just to juxtapose them, but I just felt there was something different going on in the relationships in those poems.
I think possibly both of them could be related to Wordsworth's resolution and independence. But in Frost's case, it seems to me it's a kind of parody of, of Wordsworth. Where Wordsworth is clearly concerned by the old man and the complete difference of his life. And in Frost's poem, we get these indications that this man has a very difficult life, with visions of half the world burned black and the sun shrunken yellow in smoke, etc. But at the end of the speaker in the poem says, "I told him this is a pleasant life to set your breast to the bark of trees." As if the speaker has decided, no, this is, your life is great. This is the moral I'm going to take from it. And I wonder if Frost was intentionally parodying what was going on in Wordsworth's poem. I don't know if that's an acceptable reading of the poem, but it does seem to be those last 6 lines come as really such a surprise after what we've had before that. I don't know what other people make of that.
Yeah, it's kind of an admission of a sort of Thoreauvian simplicity, maybe. I mean,
yeah.
The way that I've always read that poem is that in some ways the gum gatherer is a kind of archetype for the poet, going out into nature, gathering the jewels, and then perhaps taking those jewels into market.
But I mean, it's as if he's decided that's what he's going to do with this man's life, but it also means ignoring most of what he's actually said, what these speakers actually told us about the man's life.
I'm not sure the poem works as well as it should. I think there's a kind of tonal disconnect too. If the poem was composed as a kind of metaphor for an earlier version of Build Soil, for example, maybe. That sense of economic necessity, but I don't know.
I would agree. There's something troubling in the way that Frost, the speaker of the poem, appropriates the life of the gum gatherer in order to make a point, and that doesn't happen in Thomas's poem. The old man's life remains integral to the old man, and while there is a kind of exchange of information, a learning. An extension of sympathy or empathy, no lesson is drawn from it. And if Frost does have one of the things that you come to distrust in Frost is that sometimes the lesson overwhelms the event. Almost there's a kind of rush to judgment. He wanted to do something with the gum gatherer as a symbolic figure, and in doing that, the symbolic figure in some ways usurps and diminishes or obliterates the actual figure. You don't have a sense of the gum gatherer as a real other in the way that you do in the Thomas poem. And I think that's in part a personality difference. I think Frost, and in much of Frost, you have this sense that the lesson that I'm going to draw from this is as important as the actuality of the other, and it can sometimes diminish the poem.
And in Man and Dog, at least we have the other speaking. Right? I mean, there's almost I don't recall any voice. I don't recall the gum gatherer speaking for himself at all. I mean, it's a kind of
presumably what we learn about the gum gatherer must have come from the man's. But Frost doesn't report the actual words of the gum gatherer.
Right.
But I mean, that's unusual in Frost. I mean, he's always happy to give other people to let them speak. But in this case, he's decided, no, this is what I'm going to do with this guy's life.
Actually, early Frost is always willing to let others speak. As you move into later Frost, he speaks through them much more often.
Right.
There is a kind of ventriloquist quality to many of the characters of later Frost poems, and I think it's the same urge to derive meaning that leads him to that.
Man and Dog was based on notebook jottings by Thomas. He did write down what the man had said, and then formed it into these extraordinary couplets. And I think there, as in Thomas's prose too, one of his models was they call the Bettesworth book by a man whose pseudonym was Bourne, which was the taking down of the autobiography of a Surrey labourer, and that was a book that Thomas was very interested in, and he was interested in the rural speech of Hampshire and other places in Kent where he lived as well. But I just wonder, is there anything problematic in this whole obviously post-Wordsworthian scenario in which the poet, does note what the peasant, the labourer says, and then forms it into a poem. One thing that did strike me, there is a difference, between the man and Man and Dog calling Thomas Sir. There's something more egalitarian about the conversation in the Gum Gatherer, and whether that's true of all the figures in Frost's eclogue landscape, I don't know. But is this at all a problematic pastoral trope in both poets? Or?
I'd like to make a little observation, which only struck me in the last few weeks when I was looking at this, that I thought hoeing and harvesting in half the shires where corn and couch grass, couch grass will grow was a non sequitur. But of course, if 1874 was a fairly quiet time for the forces, it's an insight really that knows. If you're a soldier in those times, you get out and help at the harvest. And I think that's what they're doing. And he rather liked the harvesting and the sort of farm life. So that's why the old man still hankers for his little bits of farm life. Whereas his sons are out there actually doing the fighting this time. But he's a bit too old. I think this old man is too old to have joined up and done his bit, hasn't he?
If nothing else, perhaps it indicates that problem that Thomas always had, that you might want to be a countryman and be on the same level maybe as the people he meets, but they could always spot that he was really a gentleman or he was an educated man, and you could never really escape your Oxford education, even if you're trying to live in the countryside and wear tweed and be a countryman.
Yes.
And it's I mean, sorry.
Frost did face some of the same problem among his own country neighbors. There was a level of disguise beneath which they were able to see. I mean, Frost affected country ways, but he was the grandson of a wealthy man. He was college educated, although he ran away from it. So that his life as countryman always possessed that certain quality of deliberate pretense and accommodation. I don't know if it was as noticeable as it would have been in an English social scene, but it was there nonetheless. Frost's neighbors did not mistake him for a back countryman.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that
actually, it should be called, oh, sorry,
yeah.
suddenly had a thought, Bob, sorry about that. It should be called Man and Two Dogs, because he's got the foxy Welsh grandfather, which is a lovely little detail of this small bitch who can't really chase the rabbit. And then there's this rather grand grandfather. Small, yes, foxy Welsh grandfather. Sorry to interrupt.
Even dogs have histories,
No, I was just going to say in response to Edna's question, and this is something that Don has written quite extensively about, is that you don't see quite the same idealization of rustics in Frost that you do as you do in Wordsworth. I mean, Frost in North of Boston is looking hard at some of the hard scrabble and difficult lives that rural people around him have. And even though there are times when I think he wants to share an affinity with some of those folks and celebrate their individualism and their self-reliance, if you will, Donna's right. I mean, he was not a rustic himself. He came actually from a fairly privileged background, even though his early life was one of hardship and family poverty. But the grandfather, of course, bailed him out and the family out. He had a stipend, and he was able essentially not to work for a good deal of his early career because he was supported by that stipend. And and that alone, I think, in some ways elevates him. There's a sort of myth about Robert Frost that he was as destitute as maybe he mythologized himself to be. And I don't want to steal Don's thunder, because that's one of Don's arguments that he makes in the Cambridge Companion, but it's a very good argument. So I don't know, Don, maybe you want to.
No, he was in England basically on a 2-year holiday. I mean, he was there on a trust fund, which is why he had time to walk the hills with Thomas. So that it's just interesting the way Frost responds to the gum gatherer, and the way Thomas responds to the old man. Although the class distinction is much more evident in Thomas's situation, there would also have been elements of the same thing, is all I'm trying to say, in any Frost encounter with his working class countrymen.
I think I read a quote from Frost somewhere that ran along the lines of, "I came to England to be poor and to write poetry more."
And to live under thatch.
And to live under, yeah.
Just that there is, to compensate for any possible patronage, that there is that sense maybe of envy and I think it's not just romantic, of the laborers or the gum gatherers in the relationship with with the natural world, with the landscape, and trees figure in both poems. And I think, I agree that there is that sense of that the tree, all your life is dim beneath that. That's something mysterious about that has to do with poetry, just as the man and dog's affinity with trees, even though he's fallen from one, that's something that persists. And there is also a lingering mystery about the twilight of the wood, which one can read as, like the death of rural England, or the passing of a whole era, as the war closes in. So I think both Thomas and Frost in those poems do communicate that there is something mysterious that links the speaker with the man they've met in a chance encounter. There's something genuine, mysterious happens, I think, in both poems.
Right. I was wondering whether we could say something about chance and fate, perhaps at that point. I mean, the talk's called Where Paths Cross, which makes it sound like it's accident, but of course paths don't cross by accident. Someone makes them cross. And a lot of what we're talking about is fate and chance, and almost the elected friends idea, almost as if someone's designing this somewhere, that these two great poets should come together. Is there a sense on both parties that they're playing around with this idea of chance encounter? Again, The Road Not Taken is about chance and fate and how we like to write it into our lives, isn't it?
I always find it interesting that with The Road Not Taken, that Edward Thomas didn't get it. I think The Road Not Taken is sort of one of those classic poems where, I use it with students to sort of as a lesson of make sure you read the whole poem, because if they read that poem, what they remember are the last 2 lines, which of course they've also seen in Dead Poets Society, etc. And everyone comes away from that is the message of the poem. It's clear that when you that's how Edward Thomas first read it as well, and that kind of comforts me, because I confess that was also the way I came away from that poem when I first read it as an undergraduate, thinking, yes, what a great, wonderful declaration of independence, self-reliance, strike out, be your own man, etc. And of course, the poem as a whole is doing something much subtler, much trickier, as Robert Frost put it. Mm-hmm. And I find it kind of reassuring to know that, even as intelligent a reader as Edward Thomas sort of fell for it the first time and had to have it explained to him by Frost.
Yeah. I mean, I always love the line and knowing how way leads on to way. I mean, in response to your question, Guy, it's almost as if there's something in the DNA of the first step of a path or a choice that one might take that has a profound effect and will in some ways determine the path of a life. And of course, there's no real choice in The Road Not Taken when you look at it carefully. And so the idea, sometimes I read that poem as being a kind of debate between human volition and determinism. And I think as I reread the poem, it almost feels like a more deterministic poem to me than one of choice. But I also am very well aware that Frost went to England very self-consciously because the United States was not particularly conducive to a young man writing poetry. And so when he crashes Harold Monroe's bookstore opening, I think he was very deliberately trying to find a group of writers that he might be able to establish some relationships with, because in the United States, he would never have had the chance to do that on his own. The place is just too vast, and the literary and artistic community around London was far more conducive to him establishing a cohort of, like-minded people. And I think that was a very deliberate choice on his part to give himself one last opportunity to become a poet. I mean, it was, it's the greatest fairy tale in American literature, I think. I'm gonna chuck my job and pack up my bags and tote my family to England without even knowing where we're going to stay when we get there. I mean, it's a very bold and reckless move, and Eleanor sanctioned it, which is just flabbergasting to me. Mm. And had he not made that choice and that first step, the relationship with Thomas and Flint and so forth would never have occurred.
Well,
although to be honest, he didn't try very hard in America. He could have gone to Boston and hung out. There was a literary community. He never tried to publish a book in America. He haphazardly sent poems to a few magazines. It's so that when he goes to England, he's not only looking for a new opportunity, he's also gathering himself finally for the effort, which he had not done before. All of Frost's talk about being disregarded by American editors and never having succeeded is all made up after the fact. He never submitted a book for publication until he submitted one in England. So I think that the change of scene gave him an opportunity to sort of marshal his resources and say now or never. But up until that point, he hadn't really tried. He was if you looked at from the outside, you would have seemed a dilettante. He sent a few poems to the Independent. He had some nice publications, but he never attempted to do anything with them. It wasn't until he got to England that he decided to treat himself as a professional literary man. And there's no telling whether that might have succeeded in the United States, because he never really attempted to do so. So the way Frost puts together the story of a life and a poetic career is in itself quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I had a question actually, maybe for Bob and Don, talking about a choice. So supposedly the decision to go to England was made on a coin flip. It would have been Vancouver to be with the Bartletts, or to England. And I don't know if this is apocryphal or if this is some other, made up afterwards story, but that's an interesting choice when talking about free choice and determinism, to imagine what might have happened if they had ended up in Vancouver instead of England.
I don't think Eleanor was going to Vancouver, and I don't think there was a thriving literary community into which one thrust oneself in Vancouver. So to me, it was that was just to kind of pose a choice further into the wilderness, or back out into a kind of higher civilization. So I would put that. I don't think it's apocryphal. I think it's strategic in its telling.
Isn't there a similarity between Pound and Frost in that respect? They both go to seek their literary fortunes in London. Pound goes there basically to meet Yeats, and then there is a sort of jousting between Frost and Pound as to whether Frost's going to let Pound patronize him or not, and then decides not. Frost accuses Pound of being really arriviste, but Frost himself seemed to have become more like that than he'd been in America, and it's wonderful that in those literary circles, and he makes friends indeed with various poets, that there's this sort of mutual recognition somehow between him and Thomas, and that is extraordinary, and that it seems like some kind of destiny, like Wordsworth and Coleridge. I think I can think of really very few similar examples, and certainly The Road Not Taken raises all the questions about fate and choice. And I do think both Thomas and Frost are in that poem together, just as they argued about it afterwards. But then the question of choice becomes something much more demanding for Thomas and for Frost because of the war. So the choice is made in unchosen circumstances, and so that's another phase, and in which The Road Not Taken also plays a part once again, because Frost resends it to Thomas, and basically with the question, what are you going to do? What are you going to choose?
Yeah, I completely agree about that, and I think one of the striking things about Thomas's reaction to the poem is that he objects to the idea that people have choices. And he sort of points out that there's a kind of privilege to the person who has a choice. And I think he felt that, looking at Frost and himself, that his own life had been more constrained by economic necessity than Frost's had been, and that he just had to make a living to keep his family in eggs and flour. And I think also Edna is completely right that this whole question of choice started to exercise a really powerful, deeper resonance when the war began. And that not only is affecting Thomas, I read the poem as also being autobiographical from Frost's point of view. What choice did I make when I left? Not was the choice when I made when I went to Britain, but what was the choice I made when I left Britain? Mm-hmm. And he sends it to Thomas again in sort of May, June 15, when he's gone back to the States. And there's a feeling in him, I think, of actually, have I retreated from something here? Is there a kind of way in which I should possibly have stayed? And what kind of responsibility is in balance here between my responsibility to my family's safety and my responsibility to heroic sacrifice? So I think it's really complicated, that. But the question about choice is also a question about sort of cultural difference. What's the difference between Frost and Thomas in terms of their economic position, and also what's the difference between Frost and Thomas in terms of one being a citizen of a country which is at war, and the other one being a citizen of a country which is still neutral and who can walk away from it. So the poem has got two different feelings, I think, from when it's first composed in late 14 and when it's then kind of discussed between them 6 or 7 months later, when the situation has radically changed for both of them.
I think when it comes down to it, the poem is about choice, but it's about the choice of how you tell your story. It's the last stanza that makes that poem. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. So I mean, he's already told us that there was no difference whatsoever between the two roads, and it was a completely arbitrary choice based on nothing. But then he says, one day I'll be telling this differently. I took the one less traveled by, so one day I will be telling this with a sigh. I'll be adding this sigh. And this seems to tie in very neatly with what Don was saying about the way Frost was continually reinventing his past. And it seems to me that in this poem, he's actually sort of saying, yes, this is what you do. This is what we all do. So that maybe we don't have choices, but then we get the choice of telling the story the way we want to. And maybe adding that sigh so that everyone will commiserate with us or will applaud us for our heroism.
Well, the sigh also disguises the fact that the primary assertion of the poem can't be proven. I took the one less traveled by. You would have to have traveled both in order to know that with any certainty. So the poem's primary assertion is, of course, invented. There is no way to, even looking back, you can only look back on the path you took, not on the one you didn't take. I do agree with Ralph, however, that part of what changed was that the stakes involved in making a decision changed over the course of time between when the poem was written. Frost was teasing Thomas for a kind of habitual indecision. The poem was written, I think, playfully, but by the time Thomas is reading it and the time Frost sends it, the choice that's sitting in the background is no longer playful. It's no longer it's a life and death decision, and so that the poem becomes sort of loaded with significance in a way that is piled onto it by outer circumstance rather than by what's in the poem itself. Once it becomes a poem about making all life decisions, then the moment at which Thomas is reading it begins to figure more prominently. I don't think Frost intended when he wrote the poem to be saying, you need to decide whether you're going to enlist or not enlist. It was about much less definite and significant choices, so that the poem gathers its weight from the outside rather than from the inside, if that makes any sense. I mean, Thomas didn't get the joke, I think, because he didn't like to think of himself as indecisive. But later, the significance of having to choose is deeply changed. And I think Frost ultimately feels a little guilty about the persuasive power of the poem. Thomas always connects it to that gamekeeper incident, and that troubled Frost.
I can see a whole new discussion spawning here. So I'm going to be very cruel to everybody and just call a break here for about 5 minutes, quick comfort break, and then we'll move into part 2.